Our third speaker for this session is a relatively new faculty member at the University of Florida, Ed Camp, and he's going to be wrapping up the presentations, and then we'll have a rapporteur's discussion. So.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate people being here this late in the afternoon. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors as well as the University of Florida for their support throughout this work, and thanks to the organizers of this session. So like many of you, I neither like nor dislike artificial reefs, but I do find several of their attributes to be particularly intriguing from the perspective of both modeling and fisheries management. And we will go quickly over these as there will be self-evident to many of you, but these are semi-permanent habitats or alterations to the habitat, many of which, absent major hurricanes, will outlive many of us and would be expensive to remove, perhaps exceeding their implementation costs. They are also quite popular with stakeholders. And I should preface that when I'm focusing on my system here, I'm focusing on artificial reefs implemented for the sake of recreational fisheries. That, of course, is not all reefs. But so when I'm saying anglers here or stakeholders, that's what I'm talking about. And finally, they are promoted, whether that's explicit or implicitly, by governance agencies. And that might include state agencies or Sea Grant or the federal organizations, as well as non-governmentals and private clubs. And finally, these artificial reefs are often advertised as being able to affect fish, fishers, and the entire systems. They might increase carrying capacity or production. They might diminish natural mortality. They certainly seem to affect movement. And on the fisher side, as we've just seen, they seem to affect fisher choice about where they go. Perhaps in some cases, as we heard earlier, they can affect the average catch rates or the effectiveness of the gear deployed. That's basically a change in catchability or Q. And this can affect the overall utility or satisfaction that people attain from fishing. So at a system scale, they should be affecting the overall aggregate effort, which scales towards the market activity and the economic impact. But also if you're affecting effort and if you're affecting catchability, this is a change in fishing mortality rate or harvest rate. And as was discussed earlier, this can have implications for harvest regulations, particularly if reefs are implemented to affect fisheries that are near their overfishing limits, as is often the case for the snapper grouper complex here in Florida. So obviously the concern, I believe, is self-evident. We have these long-lasting, potentially unintended consequences of something that management agencies or governance agencies are promoting, and that is, are we potentially causing greater harvest rates and pushing ourselves into a position of stricter regulations, which we do not want. And my concern with this is not because there aren't potential benefits of reefs, but rather it's driven by the risk assessment. A long-lasting potential negative consequence is something that I suspect we would all be adverse to. So what I wanted to do was to create a tool that allowed interested individuals, whether those are managers or stakeholders, to evaluate what the effects of reefs might be on fish and fisher behaviors and on the fishery outcomes before they're implemented. And for this talk, I'm focusing on the first part of this, and what that means is that I'm not presenting a management strategy evaluation. That is something we can do later. But I basically built a relatively, saying a model is relatively simple is almost always wrong. It's an integrated socioecological model, and that means I've represented fish and fishers and allowed there to be dynamic interplay between those groups, and I'll describe that in a minute. It's a simulation approach, so I'm going to hold off on any specific quantitative predictions about what will happen, and I hope you will indulge me with that. But that also means that it's inherently very, very adaptable. This can be put on different species or different situations, and so what I basically built, I see it as a template where I have represented with mathematical equations fish and fishers together, and we can overlay upon that different assumptions about how artificial reefs do or don't affect things, and we can play those out to see what the effects would be. I'm going to go over the methods relatively quickly because perhaps not everyone is very interested in them. I will summarize them in a second, but to give you some background on how I constructed this model, It's a spatially explicit model with multiple sites nested within a region. I'm representing a region, for example, the Big Bend of Florida. So think about multiple counties as opposed to the entire state. This means that I can consider movement of fish and fisheries between different sites, some of which may or may not be augmented with artificial reefs. In terms of the fish, I allow for larval dispersal among the sites, assuming that there's some offshore spawning. And after the fish have settled, we allow for the recruitment process. And here I have modified Beverton-Holt recruitment functions based off perceived habitat quality, where the habitat quality may be influenced by artificial reefs. What this means is I'm changing your stock recruit parameters of specific sites where we have simulated putting an artificial reef in. Then there's a subadult or adult movement, and that can be random or advective, but it can also be habitat and density dependent. So if we have changed the habitat, this will change the fish's probability of moving between sites, but then density will be a damper on that. Similarly, if fish are categorically removed from certain sites, that would perhaps position it more like a sink. And finally, there's natural mortality. As was described earlier, it's possible that fish on certain reefs may have diminished natural mortality, so that's a knob or a switch that I've allowed us to turn on and off in these systems. I've decided to make the fisheries based off utility, and what this means is I consider the different elements of why people fish. So there's catch-related utility and non-catch-related utility. And here I've allowed there to be potentially inherent non-catch-related utility from artificial reefs. This is representing the idea that perhaps some people are just more satisfied knowing the artificial reef is out there. And if you cycle this through, perhaps it means that there are people who would fish on an artificial reef who wouldn't fish absent that reef. So the aggregate effort, as well as the choices about where people distribute their effort, is thus a function of this utility. And because that's in part related to catch, it's a dynamic linkage there. Finally, I allow a switch for catchability, which we assume can increase potentially with an alteration to the habitat from the artificial reef. And mechanistically, this would be because we're considering catchability as a rate of effective search, such that less time is spent looking for fish and more time is spent fishing. So at a system scale, my socioecological system is essentially just looking at fish metrics as a function of biological parameters, artificial reef inputs, and fishing. And the fishery metrics like effort or catch rate or overall satisfaction are a function of socioeconomic parameters, artificial reef inputs, and fish, thus the dynamic linkages. So in addition to this effort linkage, there's also a linkage with the fish movement, where that's going to be dependent on habitat quality and density of fish, which obviously depends on fishing. So if you tune that out, I respect that. Here's the brief summary. I'm looking at 3 direct ways that artificial reefs might affect the system. The first is on carrying capacity via density-dependent recruitment. The second is a decrease in natural mortality of the fish. And the third is an inherent increase in the satisfaction fisheries get from simply the presence of reefs. And then I have looked at 3 assumptions of indirect artificial reef effects. And I would ask you that you not get too hung up on direct versus indirect. We could swap the names, it doesn't really matter. But these are basically levels of assumptions that I'm going to overlay on these main effects, including the first one of no effort response. I found this unrealistic, but you'll see that I'm basically trying to bookend a range of different assumptions. So this is assuming that people don't change how they fish at all, just the reef changes. The second is an artificial reef. We'll have an effort response and a change in the site choice. And then the third, excuse me. The third is that there's also going to be a change in the catchability. I apologize. I do not apologize for no fancy graphs. I'm looking at some very simple results here, and I would like to again remind you these are simulation results, so they are generalized from running a model for multiple different species, and we're basically just looking at directional effects of putting artificial reefs in. So for example, in this case, you have artificial reefs affecting the carrying capacity, and I'm looking at 5 metrics: the fish population, catch per unit effort, average satisfaction, site-specific effort, and market activities. So this is going to be akin to jobs. And here are my different levels of indirect, no effort response, an effort response, and your effort response along with catchability response, meaning an increase in catchability. So while I'm not showing you the actual results here, I think that you will find these directional results intuitive. If we have artificial reefs increasing their recruitment, they're going to increase, but we do not have an effort response. Well, if effort doesn't change and there's more fish, we'll have more fish. There'll be higher average catch rates, higher average satisfaction, but we've previously specified no change in effort or in the overall effort. Now, if we have the effort response in equilibrium, what will happen is you'll have more fish, but there'll be more effort, so fish will go back down. So in equilibrium, we'll have generally not much more fish, about the same catch rate, roughly the same average satisfaction. Effort at some sites will go up, it will go down at other sites. The overall effort will increase. If we add to that the catchability, it becomes very difficult to even tell the direction because you've had more fish from the carrying capacity increase, but you've had an increase in Q, catchability, and effort, so you have higher harvest rates. So what will happen directionally will depend on the magnitude of these effects. And that goes across the board. We can't assume even the direction of the effects if we layer all these assumptions on. Now, when I alternatively assume that there is an increase or decrease in natural mortality, you will notice that nothing changed. That is because for the sake of only looking at directional effects as opposed to magnitude, more fish is more fish. In this case, for directional effects, we have allowed a decrease in natural mortality means there's more biomass there. So all the same things, but I would like to draw attention to something I didn't mention on the previous slide, and that is the assumptions under which you can guarantee greater fish, greater catch rates, and more catch-related satisfaction are exactly those under which you can't assume there would be any increase in the overall market activity. And that's important for many counties that are putting artificial reefs in. So the final direct effect that I'm considering here is that of artificial reefs affecting just the inherent satisfaction, and I don't think that's necessarily very realistic, but let's consider it. So if there's no effort response and they don't affect the fish, there's no change in fish and there's no change in the catch rates, the average satisfaction will increase because people on average are happier knowing that the reefs exist. But we've said there's no change in effort or the overall region-wide effort, which makes sense. If there is an effort response, and you have that effort response would come from people generally being happier that the reefs exist, therefore they will go and fish more, you'll have more fishing effort, but you haven't augmented the fish at all, so at a regional scale you have a decrease in fish, a decrease in average catch per unit effort rate. The overall satisfaction could go up or down depending on whether the happiness from knowing the reef exists outweighs the loss of utility from lower catch rates. Some sites will go up in effort, some would go down. You'd expect the overall effort to increase because the inherent satisfaction acts as a subsidy, thus sustaining greater effort at the same level of fish abundance. Finally, if we assume that there is the effort response and the catchability, you still have the fish and the CPUE going down, but you can't really predict the other ones because you're not sure about the magnitude of these effects. So the conclusion of this is that it's actually quite confusing, and there's short and long-term dynamics. I've just shown you equilibrium generalized summaries of the results of a bunch of different model runs. And I didn't even add the different direct effects on top of each other. You might well have inherent satisfaction and an increased carrying capacity and maybe increases or decreases in natural mortality. So all I can say with certainty is what I mentioned earlier, that if you are quite sure you want the fish and the CPUE to increase, you can't have the effort increasing. And conversely, if you really want that effort increasing, that's the only way that you can get that market activity, that impact that you want. Assuming that artificial reefs affect Q really adds a lot of uncertainty to the overall outcomes of these management actions. So a conclusion here for me is that the direction, not even the magnitude, just the direction of key fishery metrics like overall catch or harvest or fish populations is unclear without making assumptions about the relative importance of the different effects that artificial reefs have on the system. Thus, to make actual quantitative predictions about what would happen in a certain area with artificial reefs or looking backwards, what has happened, we need to be estimating these actual things. How has catchability changed? How has the effort changed? And that's something that some people have clearly done in some areas. However, without those parameter predictions, I don't think it's fair to say that artificial reefs can be assumed that they will improve a fishery, or conversely, that they would necessarily hurt a fishery, whatever that looked like. That's not a prediction I would be comfortable making without being able to get more information than I have right now. However, the tools exist for getting this, and in this symposium we've seen people provide estimates of how effort has changed when artificial reefs go in, some inferences of how catchability might be changing, so there's this stuff out there, and the model I built here is nothing special. Anyone can go build this model, you can build a better model. Like, we have the tools to overlay these assumptions and eventually our empirical estimates on and look at the effects of this. And also, as others has I believe mentioned, we ought to be using the implemented reefs as natural experiments to understand what these parameters may actually be. And finally, this is a point as I work a lot now with extension and engagement, I think it's going to be critically important that we communicate quite clearly what we know artificial reefs can do and what we don't know that they will do in different places. And I think this will be really, really important to avoid any losses of social capital from disappointed stakeholders that expected one thing and get something else. So I thank you for your time, and I will happily take questions or suggestions if there is.
We have time for a couple of questions.
I'm also fine with that.
All right. Well, thank you, Ed. We come to the end of our first day, or nearly the end, as we have, many of us have had weeks or months to think about what we might say at this symposium. Tom Fraser has been sitting here having hours and minutes to think about what he might say. Tom is a professor at the University of Florida in the Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences program, and he's also the director of the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. In addition to that, he's worked in the early part of his career on some artificial reef questions and has been long involved in habitat-related research, not only in Florida but throughout the Caribbean and the Indo-West Pacific. He's more recently jumped from the frying pan into the fire and is now serving as one of the members of the Gulf of Mexico Fisheries Management Council. So he has perspective on the issue. So Tom, would you enlighten us?
I don't know. Let's see. This is a tricky position. I've got about a whole bunch of notes and 0 seconds to synthesize them.